Have you ever stopped to wonder why there are two Carolinas, a north and a south? It seems like a simple fact of the map, but the story behind it is this incredible 300-year-old saga of what was essentially a political divorce. It's filled with rebellion, total chaos, and two colonies that, as we'll see, were never really meant to be one. So today, we're going to unpack how this split happened, way before the United States was even a thing. Let's get into it.
So yeah, that's the big question, right? Why two Carolinas instead of just one? You'd think there'd be a straightforward answer, but nope. The real story is a wild tale of an American divorce, and it reveals a ton about how this country was actually formed.
And the first thing you've got to get straight is that this isn't a Civil War story or some kind of recent political squabble. The split between the Carolinas is way older than the United States itself. We have to rewind the clock all the way back to the 1600s, when Carolina was just one massive, kind of messy piece of land. Okay, so to really get to the heart of this, you have to realize that from day one, Carolina was basically two different worlds that just happened to share the same name. King Charles II granted a charter back in 1663 for a single colony, sure, but in reality, what grew on the ground were two places with completely different personalities.
This chart really lays it all out. So, down south, around what's now Charleston, you had wealthy plantation owners flooding in, many from Barbados. They were there to grow cash crops like rice and sugar, creating this very urban, aristocratic society that was built on a massive scale of enslaved labor. Meanwhile, up north, a completely different group of people. Poorer folks, a lot of them former indentured servants from other colonies, who were just trying to set up small tobacco farms. You can see the clash right there. The rich, polished South and the rural, rugged, and, this is key, very rebellious North.
And we really can't overstate what drove the Southern economy. The scale of slavery there was just staggering. Between 1670 and 1715, you're talking about tens of thousands of indigenous people captured and sold into slavery, on top of a similar number of enslaved black people forcibly brought in. It got so extreme that by the mid-1700s, the enslaved population in South Carolina actually outnumbered the free population. This was a whole other universe compared to the economy up north.
So you've got these two very different societies under one roof. Now, maybe, just maybe, a really good government could have bridged that gap. But Carolina didn't have a good government. Oh no, it had a government of pure chaos. And all that did was pour gasoline on the fire.
So who was running this show? These guys, the Lord Proprietors. They were 8 powerful Englishmen in London who were literally given this huge chunk of America as a gift from the king. The crucial part? They were trying to run a colony from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Their special blend of not caring, not knowing what they were doing, and having crazy ambitions was, well, a recipe for disaster.
And if you want the perfect example of how disconnected these guys were, get this. They had the famous philosopher John Locke, yes, that John Locke, draft a constitution for Carolina. The result was this completely bizarre document that tried to mix these enlightened ideas of freedom with, well, a system of hereditary nobles and, of course, slavery. It was a total fantasy that made no sense on the ground, and it failed spectacularly.
You see, because the proprietors were so far away and their ideas were so impractical, their laws basically meant nothing. Especially up in the north, which was even more remote from the official capital in Charleston. People just ignored them. Local communities started running their own affairs, and this is where they developed this really powerful spirit of independence and a deep, deep distrust of any authority trying to boss them around from far away.
Well, it was only a matter of time before that distrust boiled over into open defiance. The North wasn't just going to ignore their proprietors anymore, they were going to actively resist them. And this is where we see the first real, undeniable proof that trying to govern Carolina as one singular colony was a totally doomed project.
And this happened in a very direct way, with something called Culpeper's Rebellion. A settler named John Culpeper basically just decided he'd had enough. And as you can see, his plan was pretty simple. Step 1, get a bunch of guys together. Step 2, literally arrest the proprietor's tax official and throw him in jail. Step 3, just set up your own government. It was bold, it was simple, and it told London exactly what the North thought of its so-called rulers.
But here is the absolute best part. When Culpeper was eventually put on trial back in England, he was found innocent. Why? Because one of the Lord Proprietors himself had to admit that their government was such a total mess that there was, and I'm quoting here, no real government in Carolina. I mean, can you imagine the embarrassment? It completely proved the rebels' point for them.
So at this point, the relationship is just broken.
The North sees the proprietors as incompetent, and the South sees the North as a bunch of unruly troublemakers. The whole colony was a powder keg just waiting to explode, and in the year 1711, a series of absolute disasters provided the spark.
It all kicked off with a devastating drought that just crippled the farms, especially in the north. It left the whole population weak and hungry.
And right on top of that already desperate scene, disease followed. A deadly outbreak of yellow fever swept through the weakened communities, just compounding the misery.
But the final crushing blow came from the outside. The local Tuscarora people, pushed to their absolute limit by the settlers, launched a massive, coordinated surprise attack, and that ignited the brutal Tuscarora War.
The devastation was immediate and catastrophic. In just the first week alone, hundreds of settlers were killed. Farms were burned to the ground, entire settlements just wiped off the map. The northern part of the colony was plunged into total and complete chaos.
The time help finally arrived. North Carolina was practically a wasteland. It was so bad that some officials actually suggested just abandoning the entire northern settlement, just walking away. But that rugged, independent spirit of the North, it shone through. The survivors flat out refused to leave their homes.
And that was the final straw. After decades of mismanagement, rebellion, and now this total devastation, it was painfully clear that the whole experiment of a single Carolina was over. It was time for the divorce.
For the Lord proprietors, this was really just an easy way out. They looked at the devastated North as a lost cause, just an irritation they were tired of dealing with. It was so much easier to get rid of the problem than to actually try and govern it. So they decided to just hand North Carolina back to the king to be its own separate royal colony.
And this proposal was welcomed by pretty much everyone. In 1712, just a year after that brutal war began, North and South Carolina officially became two separate colonies, and they would never be reunited. As this timeline shows, decades later, they would enter the new United States as separate states, one right after the other.
And once the split actually happened, the animosity between them faded almost immediately. The divorce was a genuine relief for both sides. Freed from that one single terrible government that served neither of them well, they actually became pretty good neighbors. They would even later fight side by side in the American Revolution.
So, in the end, the story of the two Carolinas shows us that from the very beginning, they were different people with different economies and different cultures. Their split wasn't a failure, really. It was just an admission of reality. And it leaves us with a pretty simple question, doesn't it? Could two worlds so different ever truly have been ruled as one?